Our second speaker is Margarita Papalitsas. The title of her project is On Human, Sex Trafficking and Global Activism, a Feminist Intervention. The present feminist intervention seeks to focus on the global social phenomenon of human trafficking with a specific focus on human trafficking for sexual exploitation at the current historical conjuncture. Despite recent increased media attention and activist interest in human trafficking, this complex phenomenon only gets worse every year. In this study, Margarita Papalitsas, drawing on her recent activist work with the Ohio-based non-profit organization Trade Justice Mission, she seeks to engage and assess some of the recent political activist projects that have committed themselves to fighting human trafficking in general and human trafficking for sexual exploitation in particular. Papalitsas claims that any productive, rigorous study of this complex criminal industry must employ an equally complex, multi-perspectival, interdisciplinary approach. Combining a transnational feminist critique with a critical ethnographic approach, she attempts to reveal the multiple social and economic determinations that enable the trafficking of women for sexual exploitation. In doing so, Papalitsas seeks to help anti-human trafficking activists and practitioners not only rethink current prevention and victim aid tools and approaches, but also create productive and efficacious tools, strategies, and tactics that are capable of putting an end to this disastrous phenomenon. Without further ado, our second speaker, Margarita Papalitsas.
President Obama's speech during the Clinton Global Initiative Conference on September of 2012 came just days after the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the executive order issued by President Lincoln, which declared that, quote, all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. While his Republican counterpart Mitt Romney chose to speak to the same audience about how free trade and global capitalism are the key to a better world, Obama chose to zero in on the urgency with which our nation must address the contemporary global issue of human trafficking. President Obama declared, quote, nations that educate their women and girls end up being more successful. Today I want to discuss an issue that relates to each of these challenges. It ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime. I am talking about the injustice, the outrage of human trafficking, which must be called by its true name, modern slavery. End quote. At this moment of global capitalism, just as contemporary advancements in technology and transportation have worked to connect countries and loosen national geographic borders, international crime has, as a result, increased and become more complex and multifaceted in the past 10 years, and human trafficking is no exception. The statistics are shocking. According to the Global Studies Review, human trafficking is a lucrative industry, generating an estimated $9.5 billion per year globally, and it has become the fastest growing source of profit for organized criminal enterprises worldwide. Every region of the world is affected by some form of human trafficking. According to the United Nations, 700,000 to 2 million women and children are being trafficked yearly worldwide. Transnational trafficking usually moves people from less developed countries into developed and industrialized countries, such as the United States, the European Union, and Australia. The 1999 CIA report estimated that 45,000 to 50,000 women and children are trafficked annually to the U.S., with approximately 30,000 women and children from Southeast Asia, 10,000 from Latin America, 4,000 from Eastern Europe, and 1,000 from other regions. There are at least 20 different states in the U.S. that are involved in trafficking, although most of the trafficking activities are concentrated in large metropolitan areas in states such as New York, California, and Florida. According to the U.S. Department of State, there are an estimated 1.4 million victims of commercial sex servitude in roughly 137 countries worldwide. From these statistics, I hope it becomes very clear that we are dealing with a very complex phenomenon indeed. A phenomenon with multiple determinations, including archaic and old established notions and practices of patriarchy, and contradictions of the current social order, which tends to privilege the logics of profit and the market, thus leading to the exploitation of marginalized people in places of high poverty, extreme gender bias, and limited economic opportunity. Drawing upon the first-hand data that I've gathered volunteering with the Trade Justice Mission, an Ohio-based nonprofit organization committed to providing alternative income opportunities and solutions to refugee women and children in Southeast Asia and Africa, I will assess how civil society organizations have contributed to anti-trafficking efforts. Since the majority of sex trafficking victims are unable to defend themselves due to confined living conditions and psychological trauma, I offer a cultural studies and feminist analysis of why contemporary anti-trafficking activists and political projects, both global and local, would be more effective if priority is placed on providing support and aid to victims rather than on criminalizing the purchasers of commercial sex, as seen in both popular and demand and abolitionist approaches and strategies. I will say more about these later. This project starts by providing a background of my personal involvement with the Trade Justice Mission. I next offer a critique of the 4 major theoretical perspectives surrounding sex trafficking. These perspectives include the abolitionist approach, which deems all sex work as inherently exploitative and aims to fully abolish all forms of sex work. The end-demand approach, which aims to end the demand of commercial sex by enforcing the illegality of it for both purchasers and sex workers alike. The liberal pro-choice perspective, which holds the post-structuralist feminist view of individual choice in regards to participating in sex work. And finally, Shelley Cavalieri's third-wave feminist approach, which proposes that priority should be placed on promoting financial autonomy for women and children who are either forced into the sex trade or have chosen the occupation due to limited economic resources and opportunity. This project interrogates the nuanced differences between the legal and cultural definitions of what constitutes a person a voluntary versus involuntary sex worker, which leads me to also consider the socioeconomic causes of the phenomenon. In doing so, I expand upon the effectiveness of current prevention and healing activism projects. These projects take an interest in the root causes that lead women to enter the sex trade, while providing alternative solutions for marginalized people who choose to become economically autonomous, self-sustaining, and liberated individuals by not entering the sex trade. A recent conversation between 2 cultural studies scholars has been specifically useful in my desire to apply an element of activism to this project, and in doing so has confirmed my long-established interest in the need to combine both theory and practice in this thesis. It was a conversation between Andrew Ross and Paul Smith who openly discussed their perspectives on the current state and future prospects of the field of contemporary cultural studies. Paul Smith, a professor of cultural studies at the George Mason University, began the discussion by recalling the early days of cultural studies when he first got involved in it in the 1970s. During this time, Smith contends the main unifying element or project of cultural studies was its desire to be politically effective and efficacious, along with its tendency towards activism. He relates that since then, cultural studies, with its importation into the American Academy, has become institutionalized in certain ways, and in the process, its desire for activism has turned into, quote, something like a phantom limb. Paul Smith then directs the following question to New York University professor Andrew Ross. What should people invested in the field do with the cultural studies phantom limb, and how can cultural studies as a whole be more politically useful? I took Smith's question and asked myself the same thing. Knowing that I wanted to study the effectiveness of global anti-trafficking political activism and projects, I decided to connect with the Trade Justice Mission. My ultimate goal was to collect data regarding sex trafficking prevention initiatives taken by civil society organizations, specifically the Trade Justice Mission, in order to determine the achievements, merits, and limitations of these global initiatives and projects. While the organization does not directly address its affiliation with sex trafficking, there are a number of case studies which show that the majority of women and children who benefit from the microfinancing educational tools of the organization are either at high risk of becoming part of the sex trade or find TJM after getting out of it. Take the following case studies for example. Quote, Jimmy from the Philippines has worked in the red light district since her teens, but now TJM has provided her with a possible escape from her old life. Mariati from Sumatra comes from a very poor family with 7 children. They couldn't take care of her, so she had to go to an orphanage. Mariati says, I am hopeful that being part of the Ocoa Jewelry Co-op will open up more opportunities for me, end quote. That's what the organization hopes for needy women everywhere, end quote. These case studies in which women have benefited from the trade justice mission have created more enriched self-sustaining lives because of it, make the efforts and successes of the organization invaluable. Shelley Cavalieri, in her work, The Third Way Feminist Account of Trafficking for Sex Work, offers a critical feminist approach, which is described as the middle road between both the abolitionist and pro-choice perspectives. The Third Way Feminist approach offers a feminist critique of social conditions generative of women's economic desperation, which often underlies women's choice to engage in sexual labor. It understands sex labor and sex trafficking as a symptom of the larger socioeconomic condition that causes women to choose to participate in sex labor, and in its understanding of that, seeks to, quote, broaden the individual's life options in the pursuit of a more robust individual agency, end quote. This third-way feminist approach is the theoretical perspective that I have been referencing throughout the majority of my project. Instead of focusing on moralistic divides that seek to define whether or not sex trafficking and sex work should be criminalized and abolished completely, or left to the post-structuralist feminist theory, which liberalizes all forms of sex work, the third-way perspective seeks to make clear in which ways the women who either voluntarily or involuntarily subject themselves to engage in sex work may also have the opportunity to choose to be financially autonomous. The grounding logic is that all forms of sex work may in some form or another be inherently harmful to all persons involved. Cavalieri goes on to state, whether or not a woman has agreed to labor masks whether her labor conditions are incompatible with her basic human rights, end quote. This is an underlying theme throughout the discourse of sex trafficking, commercial sex, and human rights. Opening the channels for harm reduction, prevention, and healing activism projects places importance on how the livelihoods of women who engage in sex work may be improved, and impoverished women can choose to become autonomous people. Although progress has been made in addressing many humanitarian causes in the last few decades, sex trafficking has actually worsened. I would like to take into consideration Lawrence Grossberg's perspective on critical, interdisciplinary, and self-reflexive modes of interrogation. Quote, the initial object of study must never displace the context as the real object of concern and investigation. A symptom is always a symptom of something else. Such small moments distill or articulate larger moments, movements, and contradictions and struggles, end quote. Millions of women around the world today face a remarkable amount of gender bias and experience socioeconomic disenfranchisement, which is the larger context by which I frame sex trafficking as a symptom of. This directly contributes to why women living in The following is a statistical overview of how gender inequality and lack of resources put women at an increased risk for slavery in poor countries throughout the world. Quote, numerous reports provide an unequivocal sense of the enormous imbalance between male and female access to education, health care, and economic opportunities, particularly in developing countries. A UN report noted that of the 115 million children around the world who are not in school, 70 million are girls, with particularly large numbers in South Asia and East Europe. Another report revealed that 600 million of the 850 million illiterate adults in the world are women, and that a lack of education is the key factor in promoting poverty, higher HIV infection rates, and vulnerability to exploitation and trafficking. The effect of these and other socioeconomic imbalances is that 70% of the 985 million people living in extreme poverty in developing nations are women, end quote. As these studies point out, there is a correlation between socioeconomic disenfranchisement and vulnerability to sex trafficking. Hegemonic economic structures such as capitalism create an environment in which markets are created for commercial sex. The bodies of sex workers are exploited for both material purposes of economic gain by the pimps and traffickers, and by the sexual demand of purchasers of commercial sex. Whether they consent to work in the sex industry or are forced into it, female sex workers are inherently victims of an oppressive materialist system in which their means of income is earned in volatile ways. Although the Trade Justice Mission has faced challenges that come along with local activism, its successes are undeniable. Currently, the Trade Justice Mission works in co-ops in Zambia, Tanzania, Indonesia, Cambodia, and the Philippines. It has helped countless young girls and women gain independence, confidence, and become more self-sufficient by teaching them how to earn a supplemental income without the supervision of pimps or traffickers. While the effectiveness that civil society groups have in developing countries is not entirely assessed in empirical or other data forms, from my experience working with TJM, providing women with the education and opportunity to earn their own income in these areas has provided marginalized women the choice to be liberated from the economic, social, and sexual oppression of sex trafficking. The third wave feminist perspective places the utmost importance on revitalizing and enriching the livelihoods of women around the world by highlighting the need for women's autonomy. Instead of focusing on on-demand aspect of sex trafficking, as the on-demand projects do, which shames and stigmatizes the buyers of commercial sex as deviant or perverted or the root cause of sex trafficking, and also has been shown to criminalize the women and victims involved while neglecting safety and health concerns of sex workers. The third wave feminist approach places higher importance in prevention, harm reduction, and healing initiatives to eliminate sex trafficking. This perspective holds that all sex workers should be given the proper educational tools and economic resources to exit the sex trade should they choose to do so. As such, legal initiatives that are enacted in order to provide rescue assistance to victims should not make distinctions between severe versus non-severe cases, as seen in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which dichotomizes all victims and leaves those who qualify for assistance open to the interpretation of law enforcement officials, who may or may not have been properly educated on the nuanced socioeconomic factors, education backgrounds, and social states of vulnerability that are all factors contributing to why a person may enter the sex trade. Moving forward, activism projects that provide rescue support and sex trafficking prevention methods to marginalized women in either impoverished areas or vulnerable social states are the most effective projects for preventing the phenomenon and for turning socioeconomic oppression into opportunity for an autonomous, empowered life for women worldwide. Thank you.